When I was locked up at Nottoway Correctional Center, we had two 16-year-olds in the compound with us. They had both been tried as adults and sent to the adult system, and they were being held in the non-smoking pod because by being under the age of 18, they couldn't be in a normal pod because they could have or possess tobacco. And they said, no, no, no. We can give you 30-year sentences for robbery and for carjacking in which no one was killed, but we can't let you be around tobacco. But what I experienced, or what they experienced, is not nearly as bad as some of the stories that came out of Angola. So let's talk about Angola. Let's talk about some of the people that were there, and let's talk about some of the things they experienced. This first guy is Chuck Daniels. He got locked up when he was 16 years old, and 6 months later he was sent to Angola, which is one of the bloodiest, scariest, most horrible prisons in the country, if not the world. And what blows my mind about Chuck is that at the time he was 4 foot 11 inches tall and weighed 90 pounds. Can you imagine being that small of a child and being sent to an adult prison that is scary and dangerous for everyone involved, no less for a child? And one of the things that I appreciated about my time in Virginia is there wasn't the same kind of predatory aspect. You did have some guys who wanted to turn somebody out or do different things, but it wasn't like if there are kids there, the two kids that I knew, nobody was going to mess with those kids. If somebody had messed with those kids or given them a hard time, one of the old heads would have stood up for them. One of the old heads would have regulated because that was not acceptable. But apparently that wasn't the case in Angola, and it doesn't surprise me that in a place that people are treated worse, they're treated more inhumanely, they act more inhumanely, they act worse. Because we have one of the most traumatizing prison systems in the world, and this kid had a perfect experience of it. He talks about having feces thrown on him, and because he was locked in the cell, he couldn't even wash the feces off unless he used toilet water. So it was either sit in that filth or use toilet water to wash himself off. Can you imagine? And his experience was he was only allowed an hour out of the cell a day. So he got 45 minutes to roam the hallway, 15 minutes to shower. Otherwise, he was locked in the cell where he was traumatized and tortured by these other incarcerated people who clearly were not in a good place and clearly should not be anywhere near a 16-year-old kid. So there's a federal lawsuit that's basically detailing just how bad these conditions were. And supposedly, Louisiana is no longer housing minors at that facility because, again, why would you send kids to the scariest, most dangerous facility in the state? Like this just doesn't even make any sense. They're talking about escapes that happen. They're talking about how bad it is. But it just blows my mind that this kid is talking about his cell is incredibly small. He has no room to move. He can't drink the water out of the faucet because it has a color and it tastes bad. It would make him sick. And he worries about his mental health being forced to be in those cells. Again, this is a kid who will probably get out one day because 95% of the people in prison get out one day, being locked in solitary confinement while being essentially tortured or traumatized by other people. Like, this is not going to be better. He is not going to leave this situation better than he went in. And this is somebody who's going to be returning as a neighbor, as a coworker, as somebody in our community. Like, why do we allow this to happen? Why do we think that this is okay? It just blows my mind again that we do these things. So thankfully, U.S. District Judge Shelley Dick ordered the removal of teens from Angola's facility due to the intolerable conditions. And anytime a court actually steps in to say that something's intolerable, you know it is bad. Because I've seen so many lawsuits where what I thought were intolerable conditions were just like, we're good. So this means they were genuinely horrendous, that somebody on the outside was horrified. And that's the thing I think about with prison walls, is we talk about, prison walls are to keep the dangerous people in. As often as not, prison walls are to keep prying eyes out. Because I think if people knew the reality of what was happening inside prisons every single day, they would be horrified and they would demand change. But as long as those walls are there, as long as nobody talks about it, as long as there are no cameras inside, you don't have to worry about it. I mention that because in Virginia, you can't have any cameras inside of the prison walls. Like the news can. If ABC News, if whoever comes, they can't have cameras inside. And the basic reason is because they were recording a lot of the horrible stuff that was happening and it was getting out. So DOC was like, hey, we got a great solution. How about we just pretend this isn't happening by not allowing recording devices in? But thankfully, in some states, Louisiana, maybe Virginia, cell phones change the dynamic because all of a sudden you have footage. I remember watching on the news footage taken from a cell phone in a pod of horrible abuses happening and then being like, oh, well, I guess we can't actually deny this considering there's video footage, but we did manage to kind of hide it from the public up to that point. So Paul Stone, who's now 51, was transferred to Angola shortly after his 17th birthday. He says a board at the prison determined whether he'd be placed in cells with other juveniles or the general adult population, and the board took his criminal charges as well as his size and his physical thing into account before putting him with the juveniles. Well, thankfully, you didn't want to just put the kid in there with adults. And yes, he committed a horrible crime. That's completely without question. The thing is, if you look at somebody who's grown up in a place that is violent and scary and dangerous, if you look at somebody who's grown up in a place that is abusive, that has scarcity, it's not that uncommon for somebody to commit that crime. And in many cases, for example, murder is a matter of impulse. Murder is a matter of me or you. Murder is a matter of a split decision. It's not a long, complicated, life process. It's not Ocean's 11. It's not planned. So punishing people for the rest of their lives and essentially traumatizing them to say, okay, well, you and this other person had a beef. You killed this other person when they were going to kill you, but we're going to punish you for the rest of your life as if you've done something horrendous and unforgivable, and we're actually going to continue to make you worse. Even though, as we know, you're probably going to get out one day because, for example, the Supreme Court has ruled that it's unconstitutional to give mandatory life sentences to juveniles because, among other things, their brains aren't fully developed. Like, we know for a fact that juveniles are not the same at 17 as they are going to be at 25 or 26 because their brain will develop. We don't take that into account, and we're still just like, oh, well, if somebody's done something terrible, we need to put them away. And even if in the case of somebody who has done something that's absolutely unforgivable and horrendous, if we need to put them away, what does it say about us as a society that we're willing to put them in a place where we are punishing them and traumatizing them and making their life work and making them suffer? Like, that's what bad people do. They make other people suffer, right? So when we sit here and say, well, we want to make bad people suffer, what we're doing is perpetuating the same cycle of violence that we claim that we're protecting ourselves or society from. It just doesn't make any sense. Um, he talks about it. He says Angola was the bloodiest prison in the nation. The stories that I've heard, I only knew one guy from Virginia. He actually got locked up down in Angola. This fairly young white guy. He'd done 2 years down there, and he talked about basically, look, I can never tell people the things that I had or had done to me, or the things that I witnessed, or the like. I survived, but just barely. And there's definitely a part of me that did not come out of that place. And I've talked to a lot of guys, and there are probably parts of me that didn't come out of incarceration, or parts of me that didn't come out whole, but not nearly in the same way of what he experienced. And again, the idea of putting a kid in a place that would terrify like a grown man, a tough gangster, or whatever, it's just unforgivable. But like I said, they're out. These kids were getting out one day, and our response to sticking them into prison was to put them in the scariest, most dangerous place. And then, were they to get out, for example, and commit more crimes or hurt somebody or hurt themselves, we'd say, well, why? They just didn't learn a lesson. No, we pretty much tortured them. We pretty much made it much more likely that they were going to recidivate, that they were going to get out and commit another crime. So the fact that they're out and they're successful, the fact that they're doing different things with their lives, to me is a testament of the human will and the ability to overcome incredible odds, because what they had to face and what they had to experience in that place, it's beyond description, it's beyond understanding unless you've been there or experienced it. It's one of those things that we can talk about, but what you're saying and the words you're saying have nothing to do with the reality of how they experienced it in their body, in their emotions, in their psyche. It's just almost yeah, it just blows my mind. But anyways, I just thought it was really important to highlight that this is how we treat kids in the carceral system. That we have, and somebody reached out to me the other day who has been diagnosed after getting out of juvie, because in a lot of states, I don't know how it is everywhere, you can be in there until you're 21. It's called juvenile life here in Virginia. So if you do something at 16 or 17 or 14 or 13, they can lock you up until your 21st birthday, and you remain in the juvenile system the whole time. That way, you're basically not exposed to the people who are probably going to make things worse for you, the adults who could further traumatize or predate or like become predators on you. And this person got out, and the list of diagnoses they got of PTSD and all these things resulting from their incarceration. Basically, they went to a place that made them much worse. And at least here in Virginia, the juvenile centers are much better than the prisons. They are much more focused on education and training and healing, and they're not perfect, and they definitely need more funding and they definitely need more staffing. But at least the center where I'm at, I'm very impressed by, because they actually care and they actually show up. Now, in those states, it may not be better, it may even be worse, I don't know. But the idea that we take someone who's committed a crime, basically that is stemming out of trauma or poverty or addiction or mental illness, and we stick them into a place that makes it more likely they will experience more poverty, more trauma, more mental illness, and more addiction. And then when they get out, we wonder why they have an incredibly high chance of going back. We're not being honest with ourselves. So thank you guys for listening. This has been my rant on why we need to not stick children in adult prisons.